And we've spent the last weekend, hopefully, getting more used to Rails, getting used to how that config routes.rb works and how it shows us what routes we have in our application and what controllers and what methods will be used to run those routes and send responses when requests are sent to those routes. We've also figured out that controllers in Rails are a little different from in Sinatra, right? In a Sinatra controller, we'd literally write our method and our URL, and now we have the route kind of doing that for us. We have the resources keyword, which will automatically write like the 7 RESTful routes for us with exceptions or with only options. And then we played around a lot in the controller and starting to make some views. And so today I'm going to get back into a Rails controller, get back into some Rails views, but I've got a slightly more fleshed out Rails application. Some of the stuff is built out, some of the stuff we're going to build this morning, and I'm going to stay focused still on this RESTful pattern that we've been doing, and then revisiting some things about routes, but primarily focusing on forms for this lecture, because Rails has a couple of tricky things about how it works with forms, and also Rails has more automated ways that it puts forms together. So let me get a screen share popping right quick. And we'll share the desktop. Great. Get rid of this. Solid. Let me make sure that I still have my chat visible. More chat. Great. Cool. Got a little chat window up. It's something. Not the biggest chat window, but it's there. And it's ours. Cool. So I'm just going to hop into this README real quick, just to kind of like set the table for what we're trying to do today. Standard Rails README, we're going to talk about forms and forums, forms and REST. So the first thing that we need to think about is differences between HTML form and Rails form. And when I say a Rails form, I'm talking about the fact that like Rails has various form generator methods. So we're going to practice with those. There's actually 2 types. And we'll learn about the why and the how of that. And then we'll talk about dealing with parameters on the controller. So, different project this time, different schema. I've got a Rails DB create this one. Probably need to bundle first. We'll see. It's probably the same bundle as the last project I was in, so no problems there. Cool. DB migrate. Boopity boop. Let's take a look at what migrated here. We created cohorts and we created students. So let's dive into the schema and familiarize ourselves with our application today. Today, the schema is going to be about a one-to-many between students and cohorts, and we're going to talk about like how to make a cohort, right? So in our schema here, we've got a cohort. Cohort has a name. And it's got timestamps, right? And a student is going to have a name and then also belong to exactly one cohort. We're not going to talk too much about the association stuff between students and cohorts today. That's going to be our focus for tomorrow morning's lesson. Today we're going to stay laser focused just on this cohort. It's got one string field, and we're really just going to play around with like dealing with that string field and talking about the most naive way that we can create something, one object, one field, and getting into how Rails is going to handle that. So right now, cohorts does have some views, right? It's got an index view. And if I was trying to scan this without like looking at it in the browser, I might try to like talk through it like so. I'd say that like we have a header saying that we have cohorts. We have some sort of a nav bar set up here where things are in list items, basically links probably. If we have more navigation links to add, we'd probably add them in as more list items into this nav section. And then here is like the main point of the index page where we're going to iterate through each cohort that we have. Where does cohorts come from? We can check the controller. The index action says that cohorts is cohort.all. So we're going to be taking cohort.all.each, and for each of those cohorts, we're going to list it, create a link showing the cohort name, and then linking to the href of cohort ID. So I think maybe as a warm-up, we could get into the app and refactor this link to the Rails style link that we ended last week with, and then we can figure out how to kind of navigate from there and then move on to cohort creation. So I'm going to say Rails S to start the server up. This should give us a localhost 3K. Yay, we're on Rails. Very cool. 1 second. I'm going to turn Do Not Disturb off because I heard a Slack sound and I just wanted to see what it was. St. Patrick's Day is tomorrow. I don't know if anybody knew that. Localhost 3000/cohorts. That's where we're trying to check out. I think my zoom is a little bit zoomed in, so once we travel here, we'll see what we have. Oh, and interesting. Started get cohorts. Processing by cohort index as HTML completed. We have cohorts. We have a link to create a new cohort. I don't see any cohorts listed here right now. That makes sense because I didn't run any seed. If I go back and look in the DB folder, do we have cohorts to seed? We do. I'm going to actually make this like ourselves real quick though. I'm going to say 021720, right? And I'm going to say this will be like 11, 18, 19. Cool. So 2 different cohorts here. I'm going to go back and seed them. So I'm going to do a Command T because I like my server still being up. Now in a different tab, right? I've got my server running here. Over here, I can do whatever experimentation or data work that I need to do. So in this case, I'm just going to run Rails DB seed. This should seed the database with some students and some cohorts because the migrations have already run. And now if I refresh the page, we should see, great, we got our 2 cohorts popping up. We click on a cohort. Now we're looking at a show page, cohort/1, and it says the name of the cohort there, right? As a review, like how did that work? Well, the link went to cohort/cohort ID. If we were to check on what our Rails routes are, the pattern of cohorts cohort ID should correspond to a show route because that is the REST convention, right? Show route for one cohort. So here, get cohorts/ID does correspond to cohorts show. If I'm ever trying to figure out where I am in my controller just by looking at the URL, that's kind of what I do. I know that I made a get request to get here because I clicked on a link. We went to cohorts and then some ID number so that I can go and look at the show route and figure out how that show route came to be. In this controller, we found the cohort based on the params ID value at this place in the URL pattern, right? So number 1 is there this time. We use that number 1 to find a cohort, and that's the cohort that we're viewing here in our show. Right here, we're displaying the cohort name, and then there's like a link to edit the cohort. Let's go back to the index page. Let me create a link back to the index page Rails style, and then we'll make these links a little bit more Railsy. So I'm going to say here, let's do an embed of a link to. Excuse me. Now I'm trying to figure out how to get back to the cohorts index. And if I want to get back to the cohorts index, I need to figure out like what URL here. I could just write in /cohorts because I know that's what the URL is, right? This should give me a link once I remember to render it. Back to cohorts. I click on this, it does take me back to /cohorts. That's fine, but I don't even think I need to write this URL because if I go back and look at my routes here, I can see that get/cohorts does correspond to cohorts index, but then over here I have a prefix of cohorts. And usually like prefix is like the brand new thing that I don't spend that much time thinking of because I just came out of Sinatra and like who knows what that's for. But the whole point of this is to let Rails start running methods for me. So I would really prefer to say cohorts path because that's what the prefix lets me do. Call a method called whatever the prefix name is followed by path, and that will return the URL that I'm looking for. We refresh, still have back to cohorts. That still looks good. From the index point of view, right, if we wanted to make this link a little bit more Railsy, instead of saying cohorts, cohort ID, for the href and the cohort name, this could all get turned into a link to as well. Let's talk about this real quick. I want to say link to. And the cohort name is what we're going to display to the user. I'm in a big embed tag here, so I can just run Rails as long as I'm inside this tag. So the next thing here would be the path to an individual cohort, right? So if I go back and look at that pattern again, we have cohorts/ID to go to the show route. So I'm going to want to say like cohort, singular, path. Of course, if we attempt to just say cohort path, that creates a problem for us because it's missing a required key. Each time we call on cohort path, because cohort path returns a parameterized URL, we need to provide that parameter for ID. And the way that we do that is by passing in either the exact ID number of the cohort or by simply passing in the cohort object itself. This should work. And that does work. There's also a shorthand for this because Rails is so conventional that they assume that if I just said the word cohort here, and cohort is an instance of cohort, Rails is going to assume that I'm thinking about going to the show page of cohort when I just say it like this. So if I refresh, we still have links, still says cohorts 1, cohorts 2, links still work, and that's our review portion, right? Kind of catching us up to where we're at right now from this last weekend. And now I want to dive in and really talk about what happens when we click on create new cohort. So here I have a form, right? A very, very naive form. It's just got a field and a submit button. Let's isolate this form and take a look at it. So this is the cohort's new form. And I want to talk about something that's happening in this form right now when we wake up into it. We're going to spend most of this time refactoring this form to be a little bit more and more Railsy. This is the first thing about this form that makes it Railsy. And so I'm actually going to take it out and start without this at all, just to generate the error. Every form in Rails needs to have something called an authenticity token as a security measure. So I'm going to refresh this page, and I'm going to spend a lot of time in my browser inspector by right-clicking and clicking inspect on stuff so I can see how the HTML actually looks. Because, well, for example, if we went to this like index page and I wasn't sure how these links really looked, we could use inspecting for that as well, right? We could really see what they look like under the hood. Then we can see that an actual href tag has been generated, or sorry, href on an a tag has been generated based on the second argument, and that we're displaying stuff based on the first argument in our link to call, and being able to kind of parse between what's happening in the Rails command to generate HTML versus the HTML itself. That's going to be a really important thing for my eyeballs to do, going back and forth. So if I go to new cohort here, we look at this form, we see that we just have a basic form. It wants to go to cohorts, it wants to do a post. We have cohort bracket name, same kind of nested naming. We're going to put stuff nested under the namespace params, namespace cohort in the params hash. So we'll have a hash that ends up looking something like, let's say like params will be a hash that has a key called cohort, and the value of that is going to be a nested hash. And in the nested hash, we're going to have name whatever the user input is. That's kind of what I'm thinking the shape of the params hash is going to be for us as we go. And so let's try this out. Let's do a new cohort, and I'm going to call it, Hell on Rails. Submit. And here's a problem. Invalid authenticity token. So the thing is that Rails is kind of built with some security stuff built in. And this is the first time that we encounter some of this security stuff in a place that might surprise us. Sinatra's never like forbidden us from just submitting a form, right? Does this form have a place to go? We wanted to post cohorts. We totally have that route, right? This place exists. So the error is not that we don't have a controller. The error is that we have an invalid authenticity token. And it's happening in this internal Rails method called handle unverified request. So as a security measure, Rails basically gives the application like this long string, which is an authenticity token value. And it's kind of like a password for a pop-up like nightclub, that if you don't know the password, you just can't get in. What we had before in the form was this particular line, which was a hidden input called authenticity token, and the value was this Rails method which generates the app's current form authenticity token, right? So if we refresh with this form with the authenticity token, it should submit a little differently. Chicago, let's do Hell on Rails again. We click on submit, and we don't have an error. We actually managed to create this Hell on Rails cohort just now, which is cool. We can take a look at what happened in the post route in a second. I just want to go back to the form and see that in this form, it actually looks different because of the authenticity token, right? If we take a look here, we have this long password string that's been added in. Every single Rails form that you create needs to have one of these somehow. And the way that we're doing it now is admittedly a little bit clunkier because we're writing some raw HTML and manually putting an input in there. Rails is going to give us easier ways to solve this problem, but it will be a problem every single time. If we don't have authenticity tokens, we're just not going to get to where we're trying to go, right? What I'd like to do here is talk about this cohort new call that's happening in up here. We're going to talk about the cohort param stuff later on, but what we're really saying here in cohort new to create is the same thing that we said before, where it would be like name is params cohort, right? Because we nested everything inside of cohort, and then name. So if we make our new cohort with this name, if the cohort saves, we redirect, otherwise we stay on the form. Let's go back and like make sure that we understand how these params are nesting and getting back into the cohort. So I'm going to say a new one, new cohort. I submit. That worked as well, right? Because we manually took a look at the params that came over the wire here. But what we saw when we first arrived at this controller was not this call, right? There's a second security feature in Rails. So not only is there this feature where we have to have an authenticity token in every form that gets submitted, but we also need to, on the controller side, we either need to pass in params one key value pair at a time, like I just did, or if we want to deal with the entire params hash, we need to do something else. So what we've been used to saying is like, what if we just said params cohort, right? Because if params cohort already has a key called name and a value there, wouldn't it just be redundant for me to say name params cohort name? So I'm just going to attempt to make a new cohort with passing in params cohort here. I'm going to call this oops. And that's why we get this problem. Forbidden attributes error in cohorts controller create. And this is probably the trickiest part of the entire lesson this morning. So please heads up on this. When you try to create an object in your controller, every time up until now, you've been able to pass in a hash if objects.new called for a hash, right? And then the object would just get created. What we have here, though, is not really a hash. If I look at params, I have an action controller parameters object, right? If I look at the class of params, it's not a hash. If I think of it like a hash most of the time, I'm going to be okay, because most of the time it looks like a hash, walks like a hash, quacks like a hash, right? But right now it's not acting like a hash. It's generating this forbidden attributes error. And that's because this action controller parameters object has this key value pair that's attached to it called permitted. And permitted always defaults to false. So if I am a Rails controller, I'm taking in params from a form that a user submitted, right? But I'm also aware that users can submit post requests using like Postman or using any other sort of like HTTP request generating tool. What happens if I have like a user account that's like this? What if I say like user info equals name user, and then we have like age 20, and then we have like admin. So I'm going to bring this window up so I can read it as well as all of my zoom outputs. Age 20, and then admin false, right? I want to create users that are kind of like this, right? That a user is going to not be an admin by default. They're going to have a name and they're going to have an age. So if I don't want the user to be set to admin by default, I might create a form that only asks for name and age when a user gets created. But a sophisticated user could figure out where that form is pointing to and could copy a Rails authenticity token perhaps from my form and generate their own form, like a fake Rails form on their own computer, and they could add this field to that form. And they could say admin is true. And if I just take in this user info hash all at once, that leaves me open to an attack, right? Because I haven't specifically said I only want name and age. If I use this kind of syntax here, I'm saying whatever key value pair lives in params cohort is welcome to be able to create cohort.new. So if I say like cohort.new, I don't know, like must work inside active volcano equals true. I probably don't want that setting to be true on cohorts. I definitely don't want them to be user set, but if somebody knew that that attribute was there, they could set it using this kind of syntax in a Sinatra app. And Rails is stopping us from doing that. Rails is going to force us, if we're ever going to do any mass assignment, passing in a whole hash as an argument instead of dealing with one key value pair explicitly, anytime we do mass assignment, we need to do something to make this params object be permitted, right? And what we need to do is call a method on it, literally called permit. So what if I said like params dot permit, and then I wanted something in permit. So I say params dot permit, and now I have a permitted params, but something different happened, right? I don't have any key values here. If I said params permit at cohort, oops, I said param, my bad. If I say params permit cohort, nil, right? If I say params permit cohort name, Absolutely nothing. Undefined method, right? So in the process of permitting, I didn't include enough language. I did make the parameters object permitted true, but I have to add a lot more than just params.permit in order to get info out of params that I really want. The info that I want is inside of the nested hash cohort. And you'll see that this nested hash itself is another action controller parameters object. So even if I said like params cohort, like I tried in the controller, we still have permitted false there, right? But what if I said params cohort dot permit? It's still empty, right? Because I haven't specified that I really do want the stuff that's inside of cohort. And the way that we do that is with another method called require. I'm going to say params dot require cohort. And if I just say params dot require cohort, it gives me this object, right? Same as if I had done this, but I can chain on with the dot require in a way that I can't chain on with this. So if I chain on to dot require and I use permit, I can permit specific keys that I want. So if I say permit name, this is my way of saying to the controller, you have given me good parameters if there is a nested hash inside of them that we can pull called cohort, and within that hash, I'm going to take in any attributes in this list. Right now, there's only one in the list, right? If I wanted to do this again, I could do like name, age, if we had a cohort, right? We could say name, maybe date. Sure. So notice that I can add another key to my permit, but because the original hash that came back only had a key called name, I can only like get stuff that's been provided to me. But what's really nice here is that if I only wanted to permit date, if name was somehow like a prohibited attribute, the user's trying to submit a name right now, it's not even going to be used. So this is what sometimes people call like permitting or disallowing, right? Or like a go list or a stop list. Basically, like if you're not on the list of things in this permit, you're not an attribute that's going to save to my object. So the syntax I really want is let's require the thing that this is about, the nested hash for cohort, and then within that, all of the keys and values that we care about. So permit name, and what we tend to do in Rails is we wrap all that up in a method, right? Now that we've gotten the right hash, name oops, which is what I wanted, and permitted is true, we tend to create a method called whatever object controller we're in underscore params. So we have cohort params, and that's params require cohort permit name. You're going to see that all the time. We call it strong params in Rails. Please don't call your method strong params. Strong params is the name of the concept. Your method should always like map to the object. So cohort new, cohort params, and this kind of takes us back to where we were on this form. So I'm going to run it back to cohorts new. Make sure that this works. I'm going to call this hello world. We'll submit. Great. So that's still working, right? We can make a new cohort there. Now I want to talk about more Railsy ways to make these forms, because this is a really tedious way, in my opinion, to make a form. The fact that I have to remember this authenticity token, the fact that like I have all these Rails generation and routing and stuff at my fingertips, and yet I still need to deal with, sorry, I saw an internet connection is unstable. So I'm going to say that last sentence again. I have the feeling like with this form that it's just a little clunky. I have a lot to do here, and Rails has a lot of ways to like shorten my work, and I don't feel like I've shortened my work very well in here. I feel like this is very manual written, right? So I'm going to attempt to make a second form that does the same thing as this first form. I'm going to use this first one up here as like a control group, right? And what I'd like to do now is talk about two different syntaxes that we can use in Rails. One is called form for, and one is called form tag, right? So there is form tag, which is a Rails thing, right? Rails has generators for this. Let me look up the docs on this. Rails form tag. And a form tag is a useful form for when you want to manually set like a destination URL that might not be perfectly RESTful, or when there's other reasons that you might want to have like configuration over the exact stuff that's in your form. Let me look for form tag real quick here. Form tag is actually a little bit deprecated. Currently, if you have Rails 5.1 on your system, you'll see that form with is very much like form tag. If you say form with and use the URL option, form with also has a model option, which kind of maps to form for. I'm not really going to talk too much about that thing I just said though. Let's just talk about form tag and form for now, and then later on when you understand both, you're going to be ready for form with in like 2 seconds. So I'm going to say form tag docs, and I'm going to find them somewhere other than the Rails guides. Yeah, form tag helper from the API. Sure, provides a number of methods for creating form tags that don't rely on active record objects. So we're just going to make a tag for a form based on where we're trying to go. So I'm going to say, let's do an embed. And the way that form tags work is that you basically open a block with them, and then you close the block, and then inside of the form tag, everything is kind of working in that same realm. So we can say form tag. And with form tag, I believe that we provide an argument of where we are trying to go. So I'm going to say /cohorts. And then we'd have an input in here, right? And generally, when we use a form tag inside of it, we use other Rails methods that end in tag. So for example, we'll have like text field tag for a specific kind of input that is text. And it's going to look something like this, right? Text field tag. If we say text field tag name, they're telling us it's going to generate an input with the ID name, the name, and the type text, which is kind of straightforward. And I think that's exactly what we're going to want to use. A text field tag for name, because that happens to be the attribute name that we're working with now. So just to fix some syntax here, form tag cohorts do, and then we'll do a text field tag name, and then we'll do probably a submit tag, I think is the name of it. Let's go check here. Submit, yeah, submit tag creates a submit button with the text value as option. So if we said like submit tag and then had some kind of string, we should be able to name a button that way. So let's try that. Submit tag, and then I'll say create cohort. So this is, I feel like, a little bit less code. Now we don't have a label tag though, right? We should probably put one of those in, and it's actually kind of the same pattern. So I'm just going to go off memory on this one. Label tag name. Let's try this out. See what our form looks like here. Did I make any syntax errors? Who knows? Life is an adventure. Cool. So I did make this form slightly more readable by adding like a little bit of a label here. But if we take a look at, and then right click and inspect, take a look at what this form is doing under the hood, is it similar to what the other form was doing? And we see that it is. Like, not only do we have the authenticity token here in this form, but we've also got like some character setting like stuff to make sure that there's no ambiguity as the form stuff gets converted into text and sent over the HTTP request wire. We have our label here. We have our text for the label. I don't think I set this label up to work right though, because my label name didn't actually work. It wasn't the same match, right? I think that these two things need to match for the label to really be a label. Yeah, see, now I can click on the label and get the input. If you're just making a label for aesthetics and not for accessibility, you should work harder on your labels. In any case, we've got our text. Notice how it says name here. That's different from our first form, isn't it? Our first form said cohort bracket name. And so I believe if we wanted it to say cohort bracket name, let me see where we had it here. It was inside of the label, cohort bracket name. Let's try saying cohort bracket name for both of these. Refresh. Now, I don't know if I like this where it says cohort name. I can still click it and get the input. Does a label, like, is this first argument just about the ID and maybe I get a second argument for an optional, like, rename? Let's try that. Name with a colon. That does work. That does work. So a label tag, like, the first thing to make sure that you can hook it up by value, or sorry, with by attribute with field that it's supposed to go with, and you can pass in a second argument to a label tag that configures how the label actually displays to a user. So this is more implementation, and this is more interface for the label tag. If we inspect this text field again, I think that we're going to have some good news. I think it's going to say cohort bracket name. Sure does. And notice that we have this submit that says create cohort. Let's try making one from here. I'm going to try YOLO because we haven't done that one yet. I click on create cohort. And look at that. That's a slightly more Railsy form, right? Because we, first of all, we saved a bunch of lines on this. Secondly, we let Rails do the authenticity token piece. Thirdly, we see that the label tag itself is a method that takes two arguments, and the first argument lets us use a label the way that we've been used to, and the second argument normally might be where we type stuff in the open space between an opening and closing label tag, but it's working pretty good, as it is right here. Our text field tag, yeah, submit tag. This is the form tag pattern. You might also see this done in terms of form with URL of cohorts. I think this works exactly the same way. Yeah, refresh the page to be sure. It's the same form. It's going to the same place. It still wants to go to cohorts. It still wants to do a method post. By the way, if you ever had one of these forms, let me go back to form tag. Form with URL and form tag are the same. So form tag cohorts, if I said something like this, method put, we could do this. It's going to break our form for the second one because it's not really where I wanted to go. But just to demonstrate, if we're doing an edit through a form and we want to do the hidden method hack thing that Sinatra did, all we need to do is add the key value pair method colon whatever actual method we want the form to do, which I think is a huge improvement from if we wanted to do it manually, right? One advantage, or yet again in Rails. Now we have, with a put form, we'd have not only the authenticity token being generated, but our hidden input to hack the method over. On under the hood, though, it still is a method hack. There's no way to get around the hackiness of the internet, unfortunately. This will not be a put. This will be a post because we're trying to be RESTful. Form tag cohorts is one way to do it. We could also try something completely different, right? Rails is very smart generating forms if it has an object to go off of. So if I only gave Rails something called /cohorts, Rails is not going to make a lot of logical leaps and assumptions for me. It's going to say, cool, you want to make a form that goes to a URL. Please tell me how that form is going to be filled out, and I'm not going to make a lot of assumptions. What I'd like to do Rails instead is give Rails an object. I'd like to say something like this. Form 4, and then pass in something like @cohort. And I'd like cohort to just be like an instance of cohort. So maybe I go back to the controller, take a look at the new. Oh yeah, it's boilerplate, right? We've done this, or I've done this before anyways, where the cohort gets set in a Rails application to cohort.new. The goal here is not to create a cohort that has any attributes that we care about, like filled in already. It's just to create an instance of the cohort class. Because when you are in a Rails form and you say form 4 and pass in an object, the first thing that Rails does is calls .class on that object and figures out, okay, so what kind of thing is this? What kind of attributes does it have? What kind of RESTful routes is that kind of object associated with? And then it figures everything out based on the object that you've given it, which I think is super cool. This also, by the way, only works if we're following the REST conventions to the letter. If I have my own ideas about what kind of URL routes there need to be, different from RESTful naming, I'm going to have to do more configuration at that point. But following conventions, right, we know that the post route is post/cohorts. Rails knows that that's the default post route for a new cohort too. So if I give it a cohort.new, Rails reads that object's class as cohort, then it looks at the object for an ID. Since it's a brand new cohort, the ID is set to nil. It hasn't been saved to the database yet. Rails is going to look at a cohort without an ID and say, so this cohort needs to be created because it doesn't have an ID yet. If I later on reuse this form to edit a cohort and it did have an ID, it would change entirely how the form was designed to work. It would go, oh, this is going to be an edit. We need to make a put request, not a post. And we'll see that work in a little bit. But for now, we'll say form 4 @cohort. Instead of form tag with a URL, we'll say form 4 with a model. And then inside of here, instead of just saying do, I'm going to try one of these. I'm going to say do F. Because when I give it the object and I say do F, everything inside that I say F dot will happen in the context of this object. And let me show you exactly what I mean by that. So I'll say label tag and then we'll just say name here. And I'll say a text field tag. And we will say name here. Why am I not saying cohort name? Because I actually intend to say this. F dot label tag. Within the context of the form we're building, let's make a label tag name. Within the context of the form we're building, give me a text field tag name. Within the context of the form that we're building, give me a submit. We also don't need to use tags anymore because this is a completely different kind of form to build. We don't really use the tag syntax unless we started with form tag type stuff, and with form 4 we just are able to say what we're making. Matter of fact, I don't even need to say create cohort. Check out what happens when I just say f.submit. So let's try this out. Let's refresh. Here's a third form. Let's take a look. First of all, it already capitalized name for us. How helpful is that? Like it knew that. If I click on name, ooh, interesting. So name here is actually going up here to this input. So like with two different forms that are identical on the page, I think I've messed up some of the accessibility stuff. We're going to ignore the label thing for now and just move on to what's happening in the HTML itself. I'm going to click in here, inspect our fields, and this is our cohort name, right? How does it say cohort bracket name? Well, because this is f.textFieldName. F. provides the word cohort, because Rails has looked at the object called cohort and seen that underneath, oh, this is an instance of the cohort class. If I had called this like widget and it was still an instance of cohort, the naming is still going to say cohort. The name here does not come from the variable that I've chosen. It just comes from the object type itself. But how fortunate that I've chosen to have good variable names that match the object type. Cool. So because it's a form for a cohort, we end up getting our nested naming, right? It also knows, because that cohort is new, that we're making a post request to /cohorts. And it also knows that the submit button should say create cohort, because it's a brand new cohort and doesn't already have an ID. Will I be able to create a cohort? Hopefully. It's going to be the cohort of hope. Yeah, and it still works. So this generator here is a really, really powerful one, right? If I'm able to provide the object context for the form, then the Rails is able to go and use that object to create nested naming inside of all of the form fields. It's also going to be able to generate a submit button for us based on the context of what's being done. Here's how powerful this last form is, by the way. If I go to this controller and I say that cohort is not cohort.new, but it's cohort.first, check out how this form changes. This third form now knows that we're updating a cohort. It knows what the cohort's name is, right? Up here, by the way, this very first form, we did put the value in. I did not include the value up here. They had value equals cohort.name. If we wanted to get the value in here, text field cohort.name, I believe we could just say value equals at cohort.name. I think that'll work. Oh no, I passed in a literal, oh, interesting. Notice how it's taking the entire hash. Like it's a hash, it's a key value pair. And I passed in a key value pair. What if I just said cohort.name? Maybe that's the value for the second argument of a text field tag. Cool. So I forgot to mention how to fill an existing value in a field tag for a second, but it's an argument similar to what we did with the labels up top. But down here, we don't have to specify that, right? Because everything is happening based on cohort already. I think this is the most powerful and the most desirable way to create a form in Rails, because it's less typing for you and it's less mistakes that you can make, and it's more stuff that you're letting Rails handle for you. However, of course, if you are getting outside of like RESTful route naming for things, if you're dealing with things that don't involve object creation at all, things like signing in a user, for example, authenticating a password, you'd probably want to use something like a form tag where you can configure your field names and a little bit more. But if we're creating an object with multiple attributes, we'd want to use the form for that kind of stuff. Let's see, we talked about differences between HTML forms and Rails forms in the sense that Rails is going to generate those authenticity tokens for us. It's going to set some character settings for us. We've talked about two different ways to generate forms in Rails, and I would just add up here that if we have form tag cohorts, this is the same as saying, sorry, let me get this little comment popping. Same as form with URL /cohorts. So if you ever see form with syntax and they're talking about form with and passing in a URL, that is what we're doing here with this form tag. And then for a form for, sometimes you're going to see form with model and then at cohort. what Rails realized was that enough people were trying to like finagle between the form tag and then the form for syntax for like the internal stuff that they just wanted to give you one kind of syntax to call on any form with, and then if you want the more configurable type you use URL, and if you want the more conventional type you use model, and kind of let the f dot stuff do the talking for you. So this is a lot to kind of cover today, and I think that your general focus of today is going to involve several steps. It's going to first involve making sure that you've got your stuff, right? That you've got a schema that makes sense for your models, that you understand how the schema works, that you've been able to seed some information into a database and like reckon with it and know that it's there somehow. We used the index page today for this, but you could have just as easily gone into a console and made sure that these things were here. When we get into the process of creating a new form, we talked about the fact that we could write raw HTML, or we could write various levels of Rails generated form stuff. And we've also kept in mind that like no form is going to work if it doesn't contain an authenticity token, but Rails does handle that for us. And then once the form is submitted, we need to kind of track how that form goes. And to do that, we go to Rails routes, right? To make sure that we are connected with the verb, the URL, and knowing what kind of controller is going to fire off at each step of this process, whether it's new or create or index. And as we track that stuff back to the create controller, we realize that we are not able to assign something like this. Can't just say params cohort, because Rails has got that thing, special kind of params object that starts out unpermitted. And the only way to permit the params object is to run it through some steps. First, we have to call .require and get out the subhash by name that we want. And then we have to call .permit as a chain and name everything in that subhash with comma separation that we would like to include in the output hash. Then we're able to do mass assignment, and then it's kind of off to the races with the same REST stuff that we were doing from before. At this point, I'm wondering what questions people have. Anybody? Nothing in the chat? Nothing in the Slack? Study group? No, not in study group. We're not the study group. We're up here. Cool. Just wanted to do a quick question scan because I do disable notifications sometimes. Oh, I see new messages. Cool. Oh, sorry. I see difference between label and text field tags, and what does the format mean in the routes? Sure, yes. So difference between label and text field tags. So label tag is going to literally generate an HTML label, and a text field tag is going to generate an HTML text field. Each of these tags is a Rails method that returns a string, which is one HTML element for your page, basically. So our label tag gives us a label. It has a for on it, which is generated based on the label name. So like label tag, since we called it cohort bracket name, they change that bracket into an underscore and we get cohort underscore name. And it opens and closes the label tag. Then the value here, name colon, corresponds to the second argument that we passed into the label tag. With a text field tag, there's also a value attribute, right? But there's literal value, not just something that the user sees in between opening and closing tags. And so the second argument fills in that value. The first argument is setting the name of the tag itself as it appears in the HTML. So name here would be cohort name. That also generates an ID in snake case, which is like a different version of that. So yeah, we have various kinds of tags, right? We have a text field tag, we have a submit tag, we have a label tag. There's also a number field tag, right? If you wanted a user to enter in like an age as a number with like those little up and down arrows, we could say number fields. There's month fields, there's even a date field tag, there's checkbox tags, button tags, and each of these has a non-tag variant. So like if I just said like Rails form label, there's our form helper that's not label tag. This is if I'm doing the last kind of form that's just the form for and includes the model itself. And then if I said like f.label, that's going to generate some HTML too. As a matter of fact, we can really just kind of look at how that's happening over here, right? Our third form, f.label, gave us a similar looking label tag as above, right? Name still says for cohort name because it knows we're in the namespace of cohort based on how we opened up the form. So that's basically the difference between the tags is essentially what HTML is going to be generated when Rails runs the method for this tag. The format in routes is actually a really excellent question. I'm glad you asked that too, because that format thing will throw you. It's in parentheses, first of all. Anytime that you see something in a route that is in parentheses, it means that it's optional. You don't actually need to provide it. But if you provide an argument for it, then it will get added in. So let me show you how this format thing works. If we, and notice how it starts with a dot too. I should point this out, where it says dot format. So format is short for file format. I could say students.html, right? I could say students.json. I could say students.pdf, right? Any kind of format that I put in a dot is going to get read as format. So let me try this real quick. If I say cohorts.html, I go there and I say cohorts.json. And then this gives me a problem. Index is missing a template for this request format and variant. Interesting. What if I say request? Request.path. And notice here we have request.path cohorts.json. Right here, .json has filled in after /cohorts and filled in the argument for format, right? So we went to /cohorts and then .json, and Rails is smart enough to know that, oh, they want JSON as a response back. And that's why I'm getting this error, right? Because I haven't created any template to respond with JSON. Basically, like, if I'm not thinking about returning anything other than HTML, and I'm not this week, I don't care about this format thing this much. The mistake that people are going to make with this is right here. Let's say that I wanted to like link to the index, from a show page. I go to links back to cohorts, right? And then I say cohorts path. But I was just in the middle of doing the other side of it, right? From the show back to the index. From the index to the show, I had to say something like cohort, singular. So maybe I get crossed up. And instead of saying cohorts path, I say cohort path here. Which would be a problem, right? The problem being that I've tried to call on a specific path. Sorry, back to cohorts. Yeah, and then it says cohort path here, so I'm kind of confused. What just happened? I'm on the show page. I go to cohort path. Let's inspect this. What does this link say? Cohort /3, back to cohorts. Oh, sure. So I'm already on this cohort of 3. So then I realized, like, oh, I didn't want that. I want to go to cohorts path, but I'm feeling a little squirrely, so I changed too much, and I pass in, like, at cohort. And you see what I've done here is, like, I've called on the index path, which doesn't actually require an ID, right? The cohorts path has no ID, just a format, right? The cohort path has an ID and a format. So I'm passing in something that I think is going to fill an ID field because I'm having a brain fart. Instead, it's going to fill the format field. And watch what happens to the URL when I click this. We click on this, and now we're going to cohorts.3, which is very confusing, right? Sometimes the mistake that you'll make is that you're trying to go to the specific cohort too. This would be a similar example. If we just went back to cohorts path here, we went to the index and said cohort path and passed in our cohort. This is the right way to do it, right? Because we're trying to go to the single cohort path and pass in our single cohort to fill in the ID. That works fine. Our links are still good. But let's say that I accidentally said cohorts path and passed in cohort. Now this is going to be totally different, right? See how many links just went blue instead of purple, like thinking that we haven't visited them before? Then we click here and we're just back to the index. And you can look at the URL and watch the number change in the URL, but it's like looking for file type .2 or file type .3 or file type .7 or whatever. We don't want that. So I really just wanted to say cohorts path. I didn't need to pass an argument in. And that actually, in this case, I did need to pass an argument, but I wanted to go to the singular cohort path. I don't just want to keep coming back to the index with different formats. I want to go to individual cohorts with different IDs. Does that answer those two questions about the difference between tag types and the format meaning stuff? Cool. And are there any other questions? Bueller. Alrighty. Well, in that case, I'm not going to keep anybody too long. I think, as always, people should be very aggressive about asking questions on Slack or via DM. We've got some one-on-one times that have not been taken yet today, so please scan that sheet if you want to have some sit-down time and just talk about stuff specifically for that you've worked on over the weekend and want to get some review on. Yeah, aside from that, let's dig into these labs today and see how good we can get at handling Rails forms. Thanks a lot, y'all. Bang, bang. Cheers, y'all. I'll get this video recorded and I'll have it up inside of an hour. All right. Peace.